Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, Executive Editor. The third United Nations Ocean Conference begins tomorrow in Nice, and one of the topics of discussion is sure to be an executive order President Trump signed on April 24th promoting deep-sea mining in U.S. and international waters. Last month, the Trump administration described deep-sea mining as the next gold rush, stating, "Critical minerals are used in everything from defense systems and batteries to smartphones and medical devices. Access to these minerals is a key factor in the health and resilience of U.S. supply chains." Joining me this morning is Teresa Tomassoni, who writes about oceans for us and will be covering the conference. Her recent piece on Trump's deep sea mining order was one of our most read pieces of the year so far. Teresa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you so much for having me.
So, can President Trump, just by signing an executive order, greenlight deep sea mining in international waters?
Good question. So, according to legal experts I've been speaking with since I've started to report on deep sea mining, this executive order does not outright greenlight deep sea mining in international waters. What it does do is it charges a federal agency, NOAA in this case, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with developing and expediting processes mining companies would have to go through in order to obtain exploratory licenses to conduct surveys or research or testing in areas they're interested in, or obtain commercial recovery permits, which would actually allow them to exploit or extract these minerals they're after. So we're talking about nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper. And the administration or this order also states clearly that NOAA has 60 days to develop these processes. So I think it's also worth noting what I'm hearing from some of my sources and what we've also reported on. NOAA has experienced significant layoffs in these last few months. And so some of my sources are questioning just how realistic it may be to develop these processes in that allotted timeline of 60 days, which would take us to the end of June.
Yeah. So in his order, Trump invoked an act, a U.S. law called the 1980 Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act, as his authority to say to U.S. companies, go ahead and deep sea mine in international waters. Does this law give him that authority?
This is a complicated question and one that I've asked my sources, and it's being asked a lot. So I will explain what I understand from one of my top sources, an attorney who's covered deep sea issues and mining for decades, Duncan Curry. And what he's explained to me is it's really important to understand the context under which that 1980 Act was enacted. At that point, there was no large international oversight body to regulate a deep sea mining industry. So this act was enacted by Congress with the clear understanding, Duncan Curry says, that it was supposed to be an interim measure, a very temporary piece of legislation that would suffice and allow for US companies and individuals to mine in international waters until a larger oversight body could be established. And we have that now. We've had that for a while. So just a few years after that 1980 Act was put into place, the UN established the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is sometimes referred to as the Constitution of the Oceans because it's a very comprehensive international treaty that provides this comprehensive legal framework to govern international waters and the activities that happen within them. So it covers or offers regulations from everything from navigation or maritime zones, environmental protections, marine resources. And under this umbrella of the law of the sea, was established another international body, the ISA, the International Seabed Authority. And this is the entity, the only entity that can legally permit deep sea mining in international waters.
But the U.S. Senate never ratified the Oceans Convention. So does that mean the U.S. is free to ignore it?
Good point. And my response is no. The US can't just ignore this. And what I'm told is for a very long time, the US hasn't ignored it, even though it never ratified it. The US has a long history of generally abiding by this treaty and recognizing this as customary international law. It's quite shocking and frustrating and frankly angering to some of my sources. These are words that they've used, that the US would change course and try to circumvent that law. And I think I mentioned in my article that the ISA Secretary General, Leticia Carvalho, even stated, she issued a statement a few days after the order was issued. And she says specifically, no state, even if they haven't ratified this treaty, has the unilateral right to authorize deep sea mining in international waters. Again, the ISA is the only authority that can do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, shortly after Trump signed his order, as I understand it, or as you reported, a U.S. subsidiary of a Canadian company applied for a permit, and they want to go and they want to mine, troll an area called the Clarion Clipperton zone. Where is this? And what's down there?
So I'll tell you where it is and what's down there in just a moment, but I just want to put out there who this company is, the Metals Company. This is the first company that has applied through NOAA to obtain several exploratory licenses, which I mentioned before, as well as a commercial recovery permit in the Clarion Clipperton zone. So this zone is a vast area of international waters in the Pacific Ocean, located between Hawaii and Mexico. It's probably the size of the European Union. It's that big. And it's long been known to have an abundance of these deposits called polymetallic nodules. And that's what the metals company and other companies are very interested in mining.
And what are these polymetallic nodules made of? And are they the things that can power EV batteries? Is that why they're so valuable all of a sudden?
So these polymetallic nodules are often described as potato-sized rock-like deposits that litter the ocean floor. When I interviewed deep sea scientist Diva Aman from Trinidad and Tobago, she described them as cobblestones, as if they might be along a street, but they're on the seabed. And they do contain various minerals that have been used in electric vehicles, although we are moving away from using those particular minerals, including nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper, etc. But I want to talk a moment about how these are formed because I find this fascinating. These polymetallic nodules that are at the center of this debate, once they form around a central nucleus. So each of these nodules started as a shark tooth that fell to the deep seabed, or a shell fragment, or a piece of sediment. And then over time, over millions of years, minerals in the seawater accrete around these nuclei and form these nodulous nodules. Um, and in the process, and over that time, each of these nodules begins to become ingrained into a deep sea habitat ecosystem that's very unique, where species have evolved and adapted to live at depths. We're talking 4,000 meters deep or 13,000 feet deep or more. I mentioned some of those animals or species in my article, anemone-like creatures with 8-foot long tentacles. We've got crabs that harvest their own food on their back, this bacteria that they eat, glow-in-the-dark sharks. So many species, thousands of species really, that have scientists tell me that have not been described or even named yet, that are almost inevitably at risk should we go ahead and allow deep sea mining in these sensitive ecosystems. And this is why I also mentioned in my article, I mean, at least 900 scientists have signed a statement asking for a temporary ban, at the least, temporary ban or moratorium on deep sea mining until we can learn more. I think 30 countries have also signed a moratorium statement on deep sea mining, or again, asking for a temporary ban, if not a ban outright, on deep sea mining.
Mm. You really talk about the oceans with real passion, and your piece I thought was quite poetic in parts. You noted that the ocean is the planet's largest ecosystem, and I think you said that only 0.001% of the ocean bed has ever been seen by human eyes or photographed by a camera. Um, so what are some other mind-blowing facts you can share with us about the oceans?
Well, that's a hard question because there's so many facts I'm constantly learning that are always mind-blowing. I have a few that I think about a lot that I think are perhaps underappreciated, which I'll share. Um, one of which is maybe sounds basic, but is so vitally important. And that is the ocean. Every breath that we take, we can thank the ocean because the ocean is producing more than 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. And that happens through various processes. But one of those processes happens through these little plant-like organisms. They're microscopic plant-like organisms called phytoplankton. And through photosynthesis, these organisms exist in the ocean, of course. Through photosynthesis, they're absorbing carbon and producing oxygen. And so every other breath that we take, I like to think like, thank you, ocean. Sometimes we only think about the trees and the plants on land, but what happens underwater affects us all. Um, the other thing I think about, which is relevant to that point, what happens underwater affects us all, affects our global climate. Of course, again, there are various ways the oceanographic processes are affecting our global climate, including currents, for example. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot is how it acts as this giant carbon sink, especially the deep ocean. And particularly, I'm thinking about the Southern Ocean. I recently had the privilege of visiting Antarctica in January to report. I was reporting on these tiny shrimp-like crustaceans called krill that really form the entire food web of Antarctica. I mean, humpback whales, seals, penguins, other seabirds, everything feeds on these krill. They're also being commercially fished to make krill oil supplements, for aquaculture feed, for farm-raised salmon. But these tiny krill play a huge role in transferring excess carbon from the atmosphere to the deep oceans. They do that by actually feeding on that phytoplankton, those plant-like organisms I mentioned. The excess carbon from the phytoplankton gets stored in the krill. And then when the krill shed their exoskeletons or produce waste, and that falls to the deep seabed, recent studies in the last year have showed that carbon is stored in the deep ocean floor for 100 years or more.
Hmm, that is mind-blowing. And there were a couple of scenes in your piece from Antarctica where you were out in the water and there were whales and there were penguins or whatever that I found as a reader beautiful and mind-blowing.
Me too. And thank you for that. It was
Yeah,
very much a privilege to witness and report
yeah.
on.
Look, thanks so much for being with me this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you so much.
And thanks to all of you for reading and for supporting our work at Inside Climate News.